Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Fellowship in Essential Oils. This week we're diving into myrtle, Leah.
We are. Good morning. Very early morning from a very cold and half dismantled shed. So, first I'll explain the lack of light, but also the myrtle crown, because the myrtle crown is the crown of the Melissa.
And there I was thinking you had a wild night and been rolling around in the bushes and hadn't had time to tidy yourself up.
Well, that's a bit rude, but I'm very tidy. I have no.
No, I'm very impressed. You've got it all
Also,
out.
it's really cold to wrap. So, yes. So, the Melissa were the ancient Greek priestesses of Demeter. And the myrtle crown, I will talk more about later. But the Melissa would wear a purple robe and a Melissa crown.
Now,
Myrtle crown.
Myrtle crown. I guess before we dive into all that juice, we should kind of specify which plant and which essential oil we're talking about. For those in Australia, they might be going, they're talking about lemon myrtle, or there's also honey myrtle and neath myrtle and rose myrtle and all these myrtles. But we're not talking about any of the Australian myrtles at all. In fact, this is a plant that's native to North Africa and Iran, but has also become quite popular and widespread throughout the Mediterranean as well, hasn't it?
Yes, a really important plant to the ancient world, and it's one that I've done a lot of work on. It's really important because it's a culinary herb. So, for example, the food of Lebanon really tastes of myrtle. It's one of the main herbs that they use. So I should say, yes, it's edible. But also it's a really, really important medicinal herb, which is extraordinary for lungs, which we'll talk about. Was also used for purification and for cleansing, and sacred to an awful lot of deities for many, many different reasons. And it's really important to Judaism as well as to Islam, because it's said that paradise smells of myrtle and that Garden of Eden smelt of myrtle. So we'll go through. I have literally got 15 pages of notes. So you might want to pause the video and get a cup of tea before we start.
And maybe a backup cup of tea just in case that one gets cold. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I guess when we look at the essential oil, it is gifted from the leaves of a steam distilled from the leaves of the plant. Let's look at it physically first of all before we dive into the deeper meanings. How do you tend to use it for the body?
Well, I've got dodgy lungs, so that's why it's important to me. It's extraordinary for lungs, and particularly for pulmonary fibrosis. So, people who have had pleurisy, me, people who have had blood clots, me, loads and loads of research into how, I'm going to keep saying Melissa, Myrtle, how myrtle is very good for alleviating pulmonary fibrosis and to help to improve the state of the lungs. There was a really interesting piece of work done by a homeopath at the beginning of the century who talked about specifically what he used myrtle for. Now, bearing in mind this is not myrtle essential oil he's talking about, it's myrtle extract. And so the difference, broadly speaking, is that an aromatherapist uses an extremely concentrated extract of the oil, whereas a homeopath uses a very, very dilute solid version of the plant. But myrtle is myrtle to some extent. So he suggests myrtle for pain in the upper left lung, going right through to the front to the left scapula, which incidentally is exactly where I had my blood clots, in the left lung. Cases of phthisis, which is the wasting disease that accompanies tuberculosis. So you're starting to really see this is a big ancient medicine. Hypoptosis, which is coughing up blood. So in my case, I was coughing up blood because there was blood clots, but also that might account for people who have just been coughing for a long time and wrenched the lungs, and so there's blood in the sputum. And the hepatization, which is where tissues and inflammation accumulate in the lungs so much that it becomes solid and looks like a liver. So hepato is the blood, obviously. So this congregation. So he particularly says if the cough is dry and hollow and sounds tickly, then that's an indication for myrtle. And also tickly nose, catarrhal fever. So it is one of the oils that I always go to if I've got a cough or a cold coming on.
It's one.
Also,
Sorry, go on.
No, go on.
I was going to say it's an oil that I don't use as much, but when we think of respiratory or lung oils, we often think of things like the like eucalyptus, which obviously wouldn't have been around that arena. It's more a southern hemisphere plant. There is laurel that's kind of local to that area as well. But does myrtle have a different chemistry, or is it a 1/8 cineol kind of essential oil? What makes it so special for the lungs?
About 50%, 57%, I think the one that I work with is alpha-pinene. Which would make it good for muscles as well. So we'll talk about that after. About 10% is limonene. So again, really good antibiotic. No, sorry, about 17% limonene, about 10% 1/8 cineol. So yes, it has that chemistry, but it makes it a really good choice for children who you shouldn't really use 1/8 cineol on at a high amount, so that it sort of counts out eucalyptus, but it's a really good oil. And there's a nature of myrtle that's about mothering, which again I'll talk about later. So lungs in particular, sexually transmitted diseases like bacterial vaginitis, trichomoniasis, those kind of cervicitis as well, inflammation of the cervix. So those kind of, especially bacterial vaginosis, elevates your chances of catching things like gonorrhea and syphilis and things like that. There was a really interesting trial done where they compared the standard treatment for BV, which I think was called methanolizotrol. I think something similar to that. I can check my notes if need be. And so everybody had that. And they then half of them had myrtle essential oil added to their treatment, and everybody got better, although the myrtle group got better faster. But interestingly, 3 weeks later, most of the people that had been treated with the antibiotic were back. Those who had been treated with the myrtle didn't. They didn't reinfect. So that was really interesting kind of information, I thought.
I was going to say with that, obviously with lungs, diffusion or application to the chest would work for that. But when you're talking about STIs, how would you recommend using myrtle in that way?
So I would make a massage oil and rub it over the pelvis and over the back so that they absorb in. You can make myrtle tea, of course. I wouldn't recommend it. It's not very nice, I don't think. But then maybe that's because I don't know enough about cooking with myrtle. Maybe there are things that you can blend with it. Given that it is affiliated to bee priestesses and bee goddesses, one would suggest it would probably be made better with honey, but I don't know the answer to that. So other things, it's very emotionally balancing if somebody's upset. It's very good for increasing libido. And again, we'll talk about that when we talk about the mythology. And also muscles. So this high level of alpha-pinene, I'm sure that I've talked about its effects on chondrocytes before. So chondrocytes are the cells that make up collagen, and particularly collagen that sits within the spine. So somebody who has things like osteoarthritis, where the collagen breaks down, alpha-pinene is extremely good for helping those chondrocytes to regenerate. So those kinds of degenerative muscular arthritic or arthrosis situations, again, I would use it for that.
I tend to use it quite a lot for in beauty. I find it really, really nice for the skin. I do like to add essential oils to like nighttime moisturizers, but I find this one is really quite beautiful to add into a bit of a mist and to spritz it around. And then as I was kind of diving in deeper to Myrtle and getting to know it more, there's a bit of a historical use of making what they call by many names, but one was angel water, where they would soak the leaves in and spritzing it over the face and even running it through the hair. So making a modern day version of that with the Myrtle essential oil, I find can be really nice for kind of re-enlivening. And Myrtle does have a bit of a springtime energy, so kind of helping to bring back the color to your face and rejuvenate your hair as well.
And it does more than that, actually. If somebody's got open pores, it will close the open pores down.
So really nice as a bit of a toner.
Toner, but also as well, I'm going to say women, but I'm sure it happens to men. But as women get older, particularly the pores on the end of the nose, pores of they grow and they become open, and particularly, and also it happens to people who've had acne, and so that's very good for smoothing those down to sort of balance out the skin tone. Yeah.
Now, when I'm kind of smelling it, it's a really interesting aroma. I hadn't heard that, apparently the Garden of Eden smells like myrtle. I think I'd go. I'm interested in going to the Garden of Eden now. But it starts off with these light notes, but as you kind of take a few inhalations of it, it kind of takes you on a bit of a journey and takes you a little bit deeper as well. And when you start, and we're about to kind of take people down this path, when you go through the deeper meanings of it, it's no kind of surprise at all, is it?
No, so excuse me, the train. So right the way through the ancient world, there's this idea that it is involved with higher beings. So in many cases, goddesses. So I know you've got some stories about Aphrodite, but in Greece, particularly Aphrodite, particularly Demeter, and the Eleusinian mysteries. And also Athena is also worshipped with Myrtle. The in Egypt, Osiris, name's gone, jackal god, what's his name? Anubis.
Anubis.
The smell of the afterlife. And interesting, the Talmud says the smell of paradise. But within the Talmud, particularly in Judaism, but also in Old Testament law, when you read the scriptures and myrtle is described, it's always used as evidence that God has interceded. So when this will change into that. So if you talk for a minute, I will find you some examples because it is really interesting.
Yeah.
So what do you know about Aphrodite first?
Well, let's talk about Aphrodite. So, we're probably very familiar with that famous picture or painting of Aphrodite who's just been born. She's coming out of the clamshell. She's looking all beautiful and naked and that type of thing. Well, the story is after that, she kind of realized she's just been born. She's like, oh, I'm naked. And so what she did is she hid in a myrtle bush until she kind of became a bit more brazen. And because of her connection to that bush and with gratitude, she kind of it gives that beauty promoting attribute. So before we mentioned that it is really good for the skin and hair, but on that kind of alluring magical ability, it can be used in that kind of way to allure and attract and magnetize things to your life. It has a really beautiful energy for like that new beginnings and new loves and that type of energy.
Yes, but you have combined two myths there.
Ah, okay.
So yes, it is involved in the myth where she is born from the waters. And it said in some versions of it, it said that she rises from the water holding the myrtle bush. So
Mm.
it's been with her since she was born. But then, the other story you're talking about was a visit she took to Kithera. Again, yes, a place where it's considered to be one of her a birthplace. But as she came up onto the sand, what she encountered was a herd of lascivious satyrs.
Mm.
And they were, well, we all know what satyrs are like. We've got huge, great erections. They're very boisterous. They've got no filter whatsoever. And so she dived for the myrtle bush and hid behind it. And the reason why I particularly pulled on that thread is because it's very good for modesty. And so you quite often see it in bridal bouquets and things like that. So this idea, and it's always about love. So any kind of sex is done in a loving environment. And key to the mythology of Aphrodite are two threads, really. The first is that she is worshipped on April the 1st, or the equivalent of April the 1st, in a Roman celebration called Veneralia. And we should point out that nowadays, people like myself and other writers will use the word Venusian when we're talking about Venus, but actually, the correct adjective is venereal. Now, that's really interesting given the science that I've talked about, isn't it?
Mm.
And so at Veneralia, what was celebrated, it was men and women both celebrating, and it was designed to encourage them to take part in traditional sexual activities, i.e., not sex with satyrs, for example, and other things. So what would happen is the priestesses would fetch the statue from the temple, and they would take it to bathe it, but they would take it to the men's baths. So she was bathed in the men's baths and made all beautiful. And bear in mind that the charites are the god are the mythical creatures that bathe the goddess Aphrodite. So they were acting out being the charites. She was lifted out of the water and then begarlanded with
Myrtle.
myrtle. Mm-hmm. And then she was taken to the temple, and both men and women would ask her for favors about love. And so things like betrothal, things like relationship problems, things about marriage. And then after that, the women would go and worship the goddess Fortuna. So she's the goddess of fortune, and asked her to bless the fortunes of the women within their marital environment. And they would go to the women's baths and bathe with myrtle headdresses on. So there's a lot of myrtle representation in there. And so we also have this idea like that venereal disease, definitely, we're definitely purifying ourselves, we're definitely linking myrtle with purification, with sex, with even with the name of the festival. But then also there's a parallel meaning of myrtle, which is victory without blood loss. Which is very interesting because this is a use that I deliberately didn't mention, that myrtle is very good for stopping bleeding. And this happens in many different myths in different ways. So the most interesting one is the myth of Aeneas, and he was celebrated in Iolaus, that's his name, Iolaus. I'm getting two heroes mixed up, Iolaus. And he had his own games, the Iolaean games, where victors were given myrtle crowns. And he was one of the heroes who was one of the Argonauts, and he helped Hercules to slay the Hydra. And so, what's a Hydra, Adam? Remember what a Hydra is?
Or is that the? Oh, you're testing me on this one. That's not like the women with the snake
So
hair,
they're
like
gorgons,
Medusa.
but nearly right. The Hydra was the many-headed monster, had lots of
Ah,
snake heads. Yeah.
that's right.
So what happens with a Hydra is every time you cut a head off, another one grows. But Iolaus realized that if he stopped the bleeding, then a new head couldn't grow. So what he did was he cauterized the wound, and each time somebody cut one off, he cauterized it, and that is how he killed the Hydra. So this idea of stopping bleeding is there, but also I talked earlier about Athena, and it's difficult to know why Athena was worshipped with Myrtle, but there is one interesting myth that also relates this idea of bloodlust and kind of takes you on another thread about Myrtle. And she loved a girl called Myrcene, and Myrcene was a tremendous athlete, and she got a huge amount of sass, had a Myrcene, and she was like, I can beat anyone. And they said, all right, and beat the boys. So she did. She raced, she beat the boys. And in true human fashion, nobody was going to celebrate a woman who had done something like that. So they killed her. So Athena was absolutely outraged. But because she is the goddess of war, but bloodless war, Ares is the battles, but she's about clever winning by strategy. She changed Myrcene into a myrtle bush, and so she had the last laugh, because even when the good runners next time won, they still had Myrcene on their head. She was still above them. And so the myrtle wreath signifies winning without blood loss. So laurel was worn for battles, and myrtle was worn by poets, for example. And when we think about the Grecian games, they weren't just about running; they were about poetry, they were about debating, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, so again, without a blood loss. And there are lots of really interesting ones, and I'm not going to go into them all because it becomes difficult and monopolizing, but I intend to teach this as a course anyway, about myrtle on its own.
When you were talking about myrtle and stopping that blood loss, that would be, I'm guessing we could use that for wounds. We were linking it to sexually transmitted diseases as well. Would this be an oil that could possibly help women that were having heavy periods?
Yes, and hemorrhoids and fibroids. It's very good for hemorrhoids. So, and how you would use it then, either you could make like a light cream to rub on, but also having it in the bath as a sitz bath, or what's the word I'm looking for? A compress, making a compress. And yeah, so those ones that really bleed sometimes, or and again, scientifically proven, it reduces the bleeding, it reduces the size, it reduces the itching. And yes, very heavy periods, definitely, I think.
Now, before we move to Egypt, you did mention, I'm trying to remember now, you mentioned three Greek goddesses, Aphrodite, Athena, and who was the other one that you mentioned?
So Demeter. So
Yeah.
yeah, so Demeter, and as I say, this is why I am happy to wear this, because the Melisai, of which I'm a bee priestess, they wore these. So for anybody who doesn't know, the Eleusinian Mysteries were the largest of all the festivals in the ancient world. And they were celebrated for around about 2,000 years, which is about as long as Christianity endured. So this is not a small thing, it was huge. And people would travel right across the ancient world. And it was thought that around about 3,000 people were initiated into the mysteries each year. And you could only do it once. It was something that you saved all your life for. And when you did it, you came out the other side changed, transformed. And interestingly, and I don't know whether this is a coincidence or not, but it really sits with me that later on it was that anybody could be initiated, but to begin with it was that you could only be Greek. So they did open it out, as long as you could speak Greek, incidentally. But the one prerequisite was that you must not have blood loss on your hands. So I don't know whether that is like a coincidence or not, but so as long as somebody hadn't murdered somebody or injured somebody really badly, if you had, you couldn't be initiated. So it was a 9-day festival, and it began with this enormous procession that went from the Acropolis, from the sanctuary of Demeter in Athens, down the Hierodoros, which is the sacred way, and along the way they would sing hymns, play musical instruments. There's loads of laughter. Young people would grab their wrists and put ribbons on them. So you can imagine it was this huge festivity, and many different stories tell the story of people having seen this procession. And they all had these huge lit torches, and right at the front was the high priestess of Demeter Kor. And she carried a staff of myrtle. And so they walked along these 14 miles of lots of different sort of rituals took place. They went to different sanctuaries, they bathed mystic pigs, all different things. But then when they got to the sanctuary itself, they had to wash their hands in holy water, and everybody was given a myrtle crown. So if you can imagine 3,000 people all wearing the myrtle crown, it was also worn by the priestesses, by the Hierophant who represented the moon. So the moon was wearing a myrtle crown. The Dadukos, who was the torch bearers, they represented the sun. They were wearing crowns, so there was a crown on the sun. And so to wear a myrtle crown was to say that you had either been like a victor in these bloodless things, or that you were an initiate into the Eleusinian mysteries. Bear in mind, it was about the afterlife. It was about an experience of the afterlife. And it's interesting that they don't tell us what happened there, but everyone else says, well, that's what the afterlife smelt like.
Yeah, really interesting. And that kind of moves me to think, as I was, kind of getting to know Myrtle a little bit better, it does have that very sweet kind of Aphrodite beauty smell to start off with. But as you go deeper, there is some depth to it. And in one of the readings I was looking at, it was talking about the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians' relationship with Myrtle, and whereas it seemed quite celebrating, quite beautiful in the Greek and the Roman times, the Egyptians kind of had a bit of a different take on it. It feels where they saw the tree as representing the cycle of life, where the white blossoms that bloom at some point in time represent this incarnation, but then at different times the black berries will come, and that represents the afterlife. But remember that it's not from either of the blossom or the berries that we get the essential oil and that beautiful fragrance. It's from the leaves that are always there, and that kind of represents the soul's journeys throughout this incarnation and into the afterworld and that type of thing. So the Egyptians kind of, and you mentioned, Anubis and Osiris before, kind of brought it into that more underworld aspect as well, didn't they?
Yes, exactly right. And it is the most important of all the medicines to Babylonian mythology as well. So if anybody knows the story of Ishtar, she or of Inanna, same goddess, different name, different places. There's a story about how she decides that she's got control of this realm, of the upper realms. That's not enough. She wants to go down and command the lower realms, which belong to her sister Ereshkigal. And to cut a long story short, Ereshkigal forces her to take off all her clothes. Remember I said about modesty? She took off all her clothes, and that was concealing a sacred totem that had been given to her. So that was stripped from her. Ereshkigal slaughtered her and hung her from a meat hook where she hung for 3 days. She was captured back by sexless spirits and brought back. And so we have this idea of the goddess who can go down into hell and into return. So actually shouldn't have used the word hell, because hell's a Catholic construct, down into the underworld, to the afterlife and back. Also, Eleusinian Mysteries, that's exactly what it's about. Persephone goes down into the afterlife, comes back. So we have this idea of being able to travel through realms, and that is definitely a use for the essential oil. Anybody who does any kind of shamanic traveling should be using myrtle to begin with, to enter that realm, to ask myrtle to be a wayfarer and a gatekeeper. But also, I don't know if you'll see this in Egyptian, or if you've got something to say about Egyptian, but often you'll hear that the myrtle speaks back. So it shapeshifts and it tells secrets and it gives information back. So I'll talk about that, going back to that story from God Has Intervened in a minute. Did you have more to say about the Egyptians?
No, I'm interested that, Myrtle speaks back. It would have been a dreadful child to have, because no one wants a child that talks back, but a plant, that's a different story.
You do, yeah, you do. So this is the Myrtle warns you. So there's lots of different instances, but particularly let's use, because I've used Greek a lot, let's use the Talmud. So I talked about how, first of all, that it represents that God has intervened. So for example, and you'll see it's usually prophets, for example, for the obvious reason that what they're saying is, when this happens, when God intervenes, then myrtle will happen. That's what happens over time. So it's always like a prophecy. So Isaiah prophesied that when the kingdom comes, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle tree. So not a thorny thing, a beautiful thing that smells of paradise. And he says, I will plant in the wilderness the cedar, the shittah tree, and the myrtle, and the oil tree. So these are all things that will happen when God comes. But the most interesting one is the prophet Zechariah, who was thought to be active around about 520 BC. And his visions were related to the day of judgment, and what his paranoia was that the day of judgment is coming. We need to rebuild the temple of Jerusalem. We need to do it, otherwise we're just not going to survive. So he envisioned the 4 horsemen of apocalypse. We've all heard of that. So he says, I saw in the night, and behold, a man riding on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in the garden, in the glen, and behind him were red, sorrel, and white horses. And then I said, what are these, my lord? And the angel who talked with me said, I will show you what they are. So the man who was standing among the myrtle trees answered, these are they whom the Lord has sent to patrol the earth. And he answered the angel of the Lord who was standing under the myrtle trees. And they answered, the myrtle trees answered, we have patrolled the earth, and behold, all of the earth remains at rest. And then the angel of the Lord said, O Lord of hosts, how long will you have no mercy on Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, against which you have been angry at these 70 years? So remember what I said about it being a shamanic protector. The myrtle said, I have patrolled the earth, and everything is okay. And there is another Grecian one about from the Trojan Wars. So Virgil's Roman epic, the Aeneid. So the Trojan hero Aeneid goes, and he's had a prophecy about where he should go and establish his new colony. And he goes to this place, and it's covered with weeds, very overgrown. So he spends a great deal of time clearing all of the shrubbery, and he comes upon this mound that has a myrtle tree on top, and he thinks, oh, I have built an altar. This would be fantastic to burn, to protect, to purify and protect the altar. So he tries to pull up the myrtle tree, but the myrtle tree speaks to him. And he tells him the story that you should not touch this. This is a terrible place. Patroclus lies here. So if anybody knows the story of Patroclus, what had happened was the great lord Priam, the king, had known that Agamemnon was coming. And so he had paid out protection money. And he paid protection money to the Thracian kings, who had said that they would protect him. But then when Troy had fallen, they had been turncoats and done what Agamemnon said instead. And he had told him to slaughter the messenger. And so they'd killed Patroclus. And where the spears had fallen into the ground, a myrtle tree had grown, and this myrtle tree was what we're saying, don't come here, this is a bad place. So you often see, and there's many other examples of this, but that the myrtle speaks back, so it has like this shape-shifting quality, but also that it warns you about what's out there, and you are aware of what's out there in the other realm.
I'm just having visions now of, a young child called Myrtle now has full permission to speak back to her parents or to her teachers all the time, because that's tradition.
Well, far be it from me to say anything about J.K. Rowling, but I think she did it the worst possible damage, because moaning the Myrtle. And I'm like, no, Myrtle doesn't moan. Oh, she doesn't moan. She's fantastic as Myrtle. Moaning Myrtle.
Very true. Yeah. So when we kind of piece together all this kind of historical uses and how people and cultures in the past have worked with it, how would you kind of tie that into people today working with this oil? For me, I kind of feel that it would be a really beautiful oil. I think it's an empowerment oil. I think it's really great for, we've talked a lot about going into the underworld, coming back. I think it's a really great one, like that kind of rebirthing yourself in life when we feel we need to start again. Maybe we've come out of a rough relationship, or we've been through a rough time, maybe a period of sickness. It's a really great one for feeling empowered. But also it's definitely not a boastful oil. It's about kind of being empowered, but again, empowered with a bit of grace and dignity about it, and modesty about it. And I guess humility and being a bit humble would kind of come under the influence of Myrtle as well. How about yourself?
So in particular, I would say, remember that it has victory without blood loss. So that, that if you feel like you are getting into an argument and you don't want to have that argument, or if somebody is trying to do you down behind your back, that's your purification right there. But more, I wouldn't really use it on that day-to-day aspect, and that's not to say that it can't be, but for me, it's a magical thing.
Oil, yeah, it does tend to come up a bit more in those spiritual circles rather than just for many people they might not have Myrtle in their collection as a general oil.
Yeah, so sometimes I'm called upon to do peace work, so like in conflicts and stuff like that, and I would not go into so sometimes so those kinds of meditations where you're looking to kind of pour radiance down onto conflict. As you can imagine, there's a lot of work to do right now. And so going into those environments where it's not a nice place to go, even though you are putting out a peaceful energy, you're going into a turbulent energy. And so I would always use her as a wayfarer there. But also, dream work, that kind of stuff, where you're looking to do like deep shamanic work or deep work on yourself. It's a really good oil. Yeah.
Now, chakra wise, where would you associate with for the chakras?
I don't think it really goes onto any on top of another, if that makes sense, because root chakra, we're looking at keeping your feet within this realm while you're walking in another. If you're thinking about periods, then you've got to say sacral chakra. If you're talking about digestion, which is definitely particularly with pork, hence the association with Demeter, then that is solar plexus chakra. Align it to Aphrodite, then you've got to say heart chakra. So you could go on and on and on, but I think really like throat chakra for finding the words to not end up in a bloody conflict, but also sore throats, and also seeing past the veil.
So let me ask you this question based on that. If Myrtle had a color, what color do you envisage with Myrtle?
To me, she is green. Do you see a different color?
No, I see more of a cold, kind of a soft golden white light with Myrtle.
Well, so that would be, I guess, that would be the paradise thing that you're picking up, I suppose.
Yeah, it almost glitters, and that kind of angel water. It's almost like there's some water with some glitter in it. It's kind of what Myrtle.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess astrologically, I'm guessing you would associate with Venus.
No.
Ah, okay.
Oh, and actually, but the way I smiled then was like, well, obviously it's got to be Venus. All of those. I mean, I've got 16 pages of myths with Aphrodite, but to me, the way that I use it, it's got to be Hermes. He can go to the three realms, which is how I use it to go between the realms. So it would be Hermes.
Now
so
you said you got
Mercury.
50. You said you got 15 pages of notes there. Is there something else that we need to share with people, or are we going to hold the rest in for the masterclass? Do you feel?
Yeah, because we could be here all day. You could be here all day. There are so many. I'll give you one more that I think is really lovely. That we don't know whether it's true or not. So I can't remember the name, so I'm gonna read it. So it says Myrtle is remembered at the shrine of Venus Cloacina. According to Livy, Cloacina was one of the epithets of Venus, and the name derives from the verb cluere, which means to purify or to cleanse. So her shrine is related to the Roman Sabine War, and Pliny says it was built when it was built, many myrtles grew there. The Sabines were going into battle with the Romans in vengeance for the rape and kidnap of their women. But before going into battle, both sides laid down their arms to purify themselves. And they used all the leaves from the myrtle bushes that grew nearby. And it's not known if this is a myth or based in fact, but they say that then there was no war. And it says centuries later, a coin from the region depicts one statue in the shrine holding a sword in one hand and a myrtle bush in the other, because Myrtle overcame the war. So again, a bloodless victory. And again, we don't know whether that really happened or not, but it's very interesting to consider, isn't it?
And when I guess when we look at it in this time when we're recording this video, that there are two major wars happening in the world that are, making a big impact. I guess anyone who wants to do magical work where they're kind of sending peaceful energy or being part of that, this would be a really beautiful oil to kind of use in those meditations and doing what you do in that way. Would you agree?
Exactly right, which is what I do. I should also just balance this by saying that it is sacred to Judaism, and when a person is born right through to death in Judaism, the myrtle accompanies them. So for example, when a little boy is circumcised, then myrtle is placed on the cushion, stops the bleeding. That it's used in Judaism, it represents the divine masculine, and divine masculine within the marriage. So myrtle is represented in the wedding ceremony. It's laid on the bed when somebody dies, and I haven't got the right page, but there's a special book that tells you the ritual of how to dress the body after death. And the second and the seventh washings of the head are both specifically done with myrtle.
We have mentioned laurels come up a little bit in this conversation as well as being, that's more of that. It is another tree associated with victory. Has there been historical references where like myrtle and laurel are kind of like the yin and the yang, where they're used as, a duo, or not necessarily?
That's not to say that there isn't, but I haven't found them. But then I do think that the laurel is a really difficult one anyway, because you're never quite sure which laurel it is. Is it the bay tree, or is it in England, for example, we have like a laurel tree that has got big, glossy, like lime coloured leaves.
Yeah.
So you're never quite sure which laurel it is. But sometimes you'll have a crossover between laurel and daphne, or bay and daphne, and sometimes myrtle and daphne cross. So not that, but there is like linkages through.
A dance between, for sure. Yes. Well, if you've got any questions about myrtle or any other oils, or you want to find out a little bit more about what's on those 15 bits of paper that Liz has got on her desk there, you're going to have to come to our masterclass. It's only a couple of weeks away. The links are below with the discount code. One question I have for the masterclass is I want to find about these blessed pigs, or something that you mentioned before. Mystic pigs. I'm like, I want to know what a mystic pig is, but we're going to have to find out in the masterclass.
Yes, I can very happily tell you the story of the mystic pigs. So incidentally, there is one more thing that I will say now. So for obvious reasons, I spent a lot of time working with Myrtle while I was doing the Melissa book, and I had an awful lot of downloads of stuff that comes from like non-ordinary reality rather than actual books. But there's loads I can tell you from actual books about the mystic pigs. But for weeks I dreamt about the mystic pigs, and that I had a mystic pig. But another interesting download was I was working in a specific place in the Acropolis called Clepsydra, which was a sacred like waterworks. And one of the things that the priestesses taught me in non-ordinary reality was how to use myrtle to journey. And what they said was to take a leaf and to put it onto the upper part of your mouth and to press it there with your tongue. Well, what I will say is it takes practice, because it does make you want to retch, and you have to use a very small leaf. But now when I'm doing meditation, that's what I use. I don't use essential oil. And what's lovely, of course, is there is always myrtle leaves in my garden. And sanctuaries to Demeter, or sanctuaries to Aphrodite always have myrtle bushes as well. So there's always a supply that you can find.
So as we said in the beginning, it's not really an oil that may be one of the initial ones that people are adding to their essential oil collection, but hopefully over this little conversation, you've realized, it might be one worth adding to. So I think it's a really beautiful oil to have in the collection, for whether it be for that blood loss, for the respiratory aspects, or all the mystical aspects we've covered today. Of course, we will dive into a bit more in our masterclass as well, so make sure you grab your tickets for that before that sells out as well. Anything else before we let everyone loose into the world again?
Well, only to say that if you want to know more about the mystic pigs, yes, we'll talk about them at the masterclass, but I've written extensively about them in my book, Meeting the Melissae. So we've talked a lot about the Eleusinian mysteries and the work that I did there. So have a look at that book, which is available anywhere you can buy books.
Amazing. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of Fellowship in Essential Oils. We'll be back next week as we dive into another gift from Mother Nature. You may have noticed we're doing a lot of leaves at the moment, and there's a method to our madness. We are coming up to an equinox, and that will be revealed in the masterclass as well. So we will see you next week when we dive into our next oil. Until then, look after yourself, look after each other, and of course, look after Mother Nature. She gives us amazing essential oils like Myrtle. Bye.
Goodbye.